Hey everybody, Dr. G here. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and body language expert, and today we're going to be analyzing the behavior and body language of Paul Ferguson. Paul Ferguson is the son of Shanda Vander Ark. He was recently sentenced to 30 plus years in prison for his role in the death of his brother Timothy. What we're going to be looking at today is his behavior during his testimony that he provided during Shanda Vander Ark's trial, as well as his sentencing. Before we get started, a couple of quick things. One, I wanted to remind you, this is not a psychological evaluation of any kind. These are just my opinions. In addition to that, I do want to remind you to like and subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. All right, let's go. So we're going to start today by watching some portions of Paul Ferguson's testimony during Shanda Vander Ark's trial.
We've already had some text messages read, and you've had an opportunity to kind of hear about some of those text messages throughout this, right?
Yes, sir.
And you sent text messages back and forth between yourself and your mother. And we have those text messages from January through the...
So he was asked about text messages that he sent with his mother. Then afterward, tucks his lips in, licks his lips. And that does two things. One, tucking your lips in reminds you to only say what you want to say, that sometimes you might be trying to hold back what you're saying. Your lips are literally disappearing in that moment. And also licking your lips helps you calm down when you're starting to feel anxious. So bringing up the text messages looks like it's causing him to feel anxious and to think about things that he does and doesn't want to say.
Between yourself and your mother. And we have those text messages from January through the time of your brother's death in July of 2022. Is that your understanding?
Yes, sir.
At some
He has an unusual presence. I don't think anybody would deny that. He tucks his chin in a little bit. He sits up very straight. He leans forward, sort of gazes through the top part of his vision. It's an unusual way to present. And so we're going to continue to see this, but he does, I just wanted to go ahead and acknowledge, he does have a bit of an unusual presentation.
At some point in time in February, there's a discussion fairly early in those text messages about blocking Timothy's access to food. Can you describe what was happening at that time and how he was restricted from getting access to food?
He was sneaking food that was not necessary.
Now, this sounds like what I presume was language his mother used. He was sneaking food that was unnecessary. Unnecessary, very much sounding like the kinds of things that Shanda Vander Ark would have talked about. And so it's sad right here to hear him talking like this, because I assume these are things he learned. That doesn't mean that he couldn't have handled this situation very differently. He could have, and he should have. But when you hear him talk like that, I think the repetition of that kind of speech from Shanda Vander Ark probably made him build this vocabulary.
Sneaking food that was not necessary at that time.
And you can continue to see his chin does go down a little bit here. And that's a vulnerability. When we leave our neck open, it's vulnerable. Our body already knows how to protect itself. So when we do these weird little motions, sometimes that's a way that we're feeling defensive. So right now, as you see his head position, that is a bit of a defensive stance. He's tucked his chin in more as he's talking about this, because this is a very dangerous place for him to be talking. This really is the cornerstone of what they're being accused of.
And it was solved by placing locks on the fridge, freezer, and pantry.
I'm going to go back and let you hear this whole portion again, because there's so much verbally that's actually really important here, not just the body language, but I really want you to pick apart what it is that he's saying. Because when you hear him talking about that they solved the problem, being the language he's using, I think suggests that he still feels this way about it, that he still thinks of things in these terms. Just listen to this again.
Food that was not necessary at that time. And it was solved by placing locks on the fridge, freezer, and pantry.
And when you say he was sneaking food that wasn't necessary, who would make that determination that it wasn't necessary?
Shanda.
And he closed his eyes when he was asked this, because he knows that his language was being called out. He's probably so used to talking like this, he's not giving conscious thought on how to present these things. Now, I do think there's some manipulation going on at different parts of this trial, but as he's talking right here, I don't think he's thinking that actively about it. And you'll notice when he closes his eyes, he realizes that he's been called out on that.
Food that wasn't necessary, who would make that determination that it wasn't necessary?
Shanda.
And as I've said in many videos, but we oftentimes close our eyes when we think about things that we don't like. So when we're caught doing something or saying something that we realize maybe we shouldn't have said or we should have said it differently, that would be a common time that we would close our eyes as we're thinking about it.
And what type of food are we talking about that he would seek that wasn't necessary?
You notice also he looked at his mother when that was asked. Watch his eyes right here.
That it wasn't necessary.
Shanda.
And what type of food are we talking about that he would seek that wasn't necessary?
So when he was asked this, he also scooted his chair back. This is making him uncomfortable because oftentimes Timothy was not given food, even the basics. I mean, obviously not. So this is something that he knows is a vulnerability for him. So when we scoot our chair back, that creates space between us and the person asking us questions. When we're uncomfortable, we want to disconnect a little bit. That's the same reason that we stop looking at someone, that we look down or we look around. So as he's adjusting his seat, we know that this is a place that's really uncomfortable for him. It's a place that they're hitting on something that is meaningful.
That determination that it wasn't necessary.
Shanda.
And what type of food are we talking about that he would seek that wasn't necessary?
Sweets or anything he could really get his hands on.
So as early as February.
And he can't stop looking at his mother as he's responding to this. He just looked at her 3 times as he's answering this question.
Really get his hands on.
So as early as February, there was restriction, the locks.
And then you saw he clenched his jaw after that. So there was a bit of tension. He looked at his mother 3 times, clenched his jaw. This is a place that's really uncomfortable for him.
So as early as February, there was restriction, the locks were going on the freezer and the refrigerator, and you said there was also some type of lock on the pantry. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And we've heard a text exchange, but at some point,
As you can see, he continues to look the direction of his mother.
a little bit later, as things are progressing into April, was there a time where Timothy was doing something?
And you saw that shift of the neck. I know I'm stopping this a lot. I try to get a little bit more space between when I pause, but he's got so much body language. I'm really trying to help you see it all. But basically, you saw him doing this. We hold a lot of tension in our shoulders. He's trying to relieve that as he's talking. So if I was an attorney right here watching this, I would be focusing in on the things that make him more uncomfortable. When you see these kinds of adjustments, you know you're hitting on something meaningful.
Some type of lock on the pantry. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And we've heard a text exchange, but at some point, a little bit later, as things are progressing into April, was there a time where Timothy was doing something to get the locks off of the pantry door?
He was pulling them off by hand.
Let me ask you this way: were you given some instruction to replace that lock?
Yes.
And who gave you that instruction?
Shanda.
And what was your understanding of why you were locking the?
Now, that was interesting. Now, we saw his eyebrows flash up for a second after he said Shanda. Typically, we raise our eyebrows to bring attention to our face. We want people to hear what we're saying at those times. This was a little unusual. Watch this.
Some instruction to replace that lock?
Yes.
And who gave you that instruction?
Shanda.
And
So I'm guessing that something he thought about made him raise his eyebrows. That was interesting because there was nothing else chronologically that made sense. It wasn't synchronizing with anything else. So it was probably an internal dialogue that made that happen. What he was saying to himself, we don't know, but it's worth noting that that happened.
let's talk about your brother Timothy for just a little bit. Did Timothy have some special needs?
Yes.
What was your understanding of what his special needs were?
He was attention deficit hyperactive disorder, as well as autistic. He had speech and motor impairments.
Speech and what type of impairments?
Motor impairments, movement impairments.
Movement impairments?
It's even sadder hearing him list off all of the challenges that Timothy had because it shows an awareness of those challenges. It shows that he knows what the problems were, the challenges and disabilities that Timothy had. So he can't claim that he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know that Timothy was vulnerable. He clearly does, in very specific terms, know that Timothy is very vulnerable.
As far as you know, from the time that Timothy came to live with you in May of 2021 in Norton Shores to the time of his death, did you ever see Timothy go to a doctor?
No.
You'll notice his posture is changing. He's been sitting very upright responding to these questions. Now he's starting to slump down in his chair a bit. Sometimes we see this as a loss of confidence over the course of the testimony.
Did Timothy go to school?
Not public, no.
How was he schooled?
Home.
Let's move up to the day before your brother passed away. Do you remember the day before your brother died?
He was unresponsive when I was told to get him up.
So you were given some instructions to wake him up in the morning?
Yes.
Was your mother already at work?
Yes.
Were the cameras activated at that point, though?
Yes.
So your responsibility when you had to go wake him up was what? Just to do what? To get him up?
Just wake him up, which normally wasn't difficult before then.
Now, what I'm noticing here is more of what we're not seeing than what we are. And what we're not seeing is much emotion. He seems very flat. He seems to be talking about his brother as though it's just another thing that happened. He's not showing a connection to what happened. He's not showing a connection to the fact that his brother died.
And what did you, so describe for the jury exactly what you did with that pizza roll with Timothy in the tub.
I held it close, and when he responded, as per instruction, I was to pull it away from him.
So you actually held a pizza roll in front of him to see if he would respond. Is that yes?
Yes, sir.
I know it's difficult. Did he respond?
Yes, sir.
And what did you do?
So this is different right here. He's wincing as though he's literally in pain. And I don't know if that he just wants to give off the impression that he's uncomfortable or that he feels something, but this does not look like someone who is experiencing internal pain.
Is that yes?
Yes, sir.
I know it's difficult. Did he respond?
Yes, sir.
And what did you do when he tried?
And it's not that people can't have pained facial expressions when they're thinking about something that is hurtful or thinking about something that's very intense, but the way that it comes up from no emotion to all of a sudden wincing as though he's physically feeling it feels inauthentic. It seems inauthentic.
Actually held a pizza roll in front of him to see if he would respond. Is that yes?
Yes, sir.
I know it's difficult. Did he respond?
Yes, sir.
And what did you do when he tried to respond?
I had to, or as I was told, I pulled it away.
So we didn't get to eat the pizza roll.
No.
And now we're back to baseline with no emotion. And that's what's so unusual when he has these points where he winces or where he shows something that looks like pain. Then it goes back to nothing again. So I think that when people see this, they react confused. They can't quite figure out what it is that they're observing because his body language is unusual. All right, we're going to wrap up with his testimony because I feel like we've got a good idea of what his body language is like. Now let's watch some of the sentencing.
Assessments. One is from a Thomas D. Shazer, psychiatrist, forensic psychologist for Ann Arbor.
So what's so interesting is he's staring so deeply into the camera. He's looking and thinking so hard as he's doing this, but he's not showing any emotion. He just seems almost curious.
25 pages in length that was submitted by defense counsel at the urging, I will say, of the court, asking for that.
Current placement of his younger half-brother G. They had intended to be here in support this morning, but were ill this weekend.
Okay, yeah, I have also considered that too. Did you receive a copy of that as well, Mr. Roberts?
I did.
Okay, I've read that too. I've gotten a large number of letters from people that I would say unrelated to this case specifically.
So you're seeing what looks to be joy coming across his face. It looks like a combination of amusement and joy. You can see the lines next to his eyes. You can see what appears to be a very genuine smile emerging. And this is the first time that I've seen him smile about anything.
Just individuals who saw it on court TV and expressing an opinion. I am not considering those in sentencing.
It looks like a combination of pride and amusement as he's talking about all the letters that people sent in that have seen him on court TV and whatnot. I'm not sure who he looked back at when that was said, but he really seemed to be connecting with somebody on that. This really seems to be a point of pride for him.
Case specifically, just individuals who saw it on court TV and expressing an opinion. I am not considering those in sentencing. Because, one, they're not directly connected to the case. And I do appreciate the comments from individuals. We limit the record to people who actually have something to do with this case or connected with the victim. So unless there's an objection.
So you see him clenching his jaw as he's talking about that he's not considering these letters. Whether they're positive or negative about Paul Ferguson, we don't know. I don't think Paul Ferguson knows either. But you saw as the judge is talking, he's clenching his jaw right there.
People who actually have something to do with this case or connected with the victim. So unless there's an objection.
We associate that with stress, sometimes aggression.
That I've read them, but I'm not using it as a consideration. So any objection to that, Mr. Roberts? Mr.
And then you saw the corner of his mouth right here. Watch this.
Read them, but I'm not using it as a consideration. So any objection to that, Mr.
Now, oftentimes we associate this with contempt when people have a one-sided smirk. When it's involuntary, we think of that as being associated with contempt. However, it could be that he's trying to suppress a smile. It doesn't look like that to me, but that's possible as well. So that could be an alternative explanation for what we're seeing.
Mr. Allen Brady.
I would note, not having seen copies of those, I can't comment on the specific letter, but no issue with that, Your Honor.
Yeah, I mean, there's just random.
Now, check this out right here. Look at the edges of his eyebrows, like right near his nose. They're going up in a direction that we oftentimes associate with sadness. Now, why he would be feeling sad right here is anybody's guess, because the context of what they're talking about is that they're not going to be using letters sent in from people that watch this on court TV, that he read them, but they're not going to be included. And as he's talking about this, you see a look of sadness creep over his face. That's not something we saw at all during his testimony in Shanda Vander Ark's trial. So for this to be the first time that I've observed the eyebrows appearing sad, very unusual.
Specific letter, but no issue with that, Your Honor.
Yeah, I mean, there's just random people who saw it on TV, and I just don't think.
Then we squint the eyes when he said there were random people who saw it on TV. It sounds like he's hearing something that he doesn't like. He's squinting his eyes. That looks like he doesn't like that comment.
It's appropriate for the court to take that into consideration for sentencing purposes. I don't think that's fair to Mr. Ferguson. So, anyway.
Before I go into the multiple points I plan to address.
So the prosecutor has basically just gone through an evaluation that was given to Paul Ferguson and has talked about his concerns and has basically said he thinks he should get a sentence that would be the duration of the rest of his life, essentially.
I understand the prosecutor's characterization of Paul as being the enforcer.
Now, you'll notice that his body posture is very different than it was before. He oftentimes sits up very straight, almost rigidly straight. And right now, he's hunched over. His head is tilted downward. We oftentimes see this, as I've said many times before, as a loss of confidence. So right now, as he's hearing all of these things, as he's awaiting his sentence, it does seem to be that his confidence is not very strong.
Enforcer as being the primary one. But I believe part of that is based simply on the evidence that we have. This court's heard the text messages, extensive text messages, of Ms. Vander Ark instructing Paul on what he was to do to Tim.
You see him licking his lips throughout this. We do this to soothe ourselves. So as they're talking about this, this is probably generating some stress, anxiety, all of those feelings.
Timothy, doing whatever she did. Paul was at work. She didn't have to send text messages to herself. Timothy's not here to talk about what happened when it was just him and his mother.
So they're talking about Timothy not being here, those types of things. And what we're not seeing, once again, is any emotion on his face. We're not seeing any sadness. The only times we've seen that were times where it didn't really make much sense. So it is interesting to continue to watch his reaction as his behaviors and as the things that he's done are being explained to the court.
I disagree with that characterization. I believe, based on what we do know of Ms. Vander Ark, that there was far, far more that went on. There was far, far more that she did that there simply is no evidence of, no one to speak of, because the only person alive who knows what she did is her.
So one thing that we're gathering from this, and especially if from what the prosecutor said, he suggested some sort of antisocial personality disorder. Those are people that are very low in empathy, very high on manipulation. Is he engaging in manipulative behaviors right now? Is he sitting, not looking up because he wants to appear as though he's experiencing shame or as though he feels bad for some of the things that he did? I don't know if he has that level of awareness about the way that he looks.
Far more capacity to understand what she was doing and the potential consequences of what she was doing than her son, who was a 20-year-old high school graduate who worked as a dishwasher.
Now he's trying to hide a smile. Now he's looking down, and you can see a very distinct smile creep across his face.
There's simply no comparison.
Then you saw the eyebrow flash. Once again, is this dialogue going on in his head? What is it that he's thinking about? Is it the idea that they're blaming Shanda for these behaviors and that he was more of a willing participant than is being described right now? Watch this again in context.
Than her son, who was a 20-year-old high school graduate who worked as a dishwasher. There's simply no comparison in capacity, in life experience, in an ability to understand and recognize what was happening.
Mr. Ferguson was clearly either psychotic or suffering from symptoms of a mood disorder at the time of the current interview. And he was apparently functioning within at least the normal range of intellectual ability at this time. Thus, in my opinion, he does not suffer from a chronic psychotic disorder, a chronic mood disorder, or an intellectual disability.
So the report is basically saying that he had normal intellectual functioning. To determine that, we typically give an IQ test. And IQ tests are pretty challenging. They are involved, they're long. If somebody is wildly psychotic or so depressed that they're psychotic, or if they're dealing with an issue of some sort of intellectual disability, they can't get within the average range. It actually takes a pretty good effort to do that. So as they're talking about this, that's essentially what they're saying, is that because he scored within the average range, it eliminates a lot of other different factors, because somebody with those issues wouldn't be able to do that.
There's another reference more to the end of the report where he indicates, thus, his referring to Mr. Ferguson, his educational history is inconsistent with him suffering from intellectual deficits, and as noted above, he was apparently functioning within at least the normal range of intellectual ability at the time of the current interview. Mr. Ferguson will not get the help he needs in prison. I think he's one step away from becoming a psychopath like his mother.
So I've mentioned a couple of times how when people look down, that can be associated with loss of confidence. Now, this is the first time that he may have truly understood that the court is about to give him a very stiff sentence, because the judge said that he may become a psychopath like his mother. And that seems to be that he had a very strong reaction to that. Watch this again.
Is concerned that Mr. Ferguson will not get the help he needs in prison. I think he's one step away from becoming a psychopath like his mother.
That may be the moment that he's realizing that this is not going to go the way he wants it to.
And the court is concerned that he represents a danger to the public. That if released, he would present a significant danger to the public.
So now this is very clearly being framed in a way that's the judge is clearly seeing him as a danger.
Running up and down stairs, cleaning out a garage with no pants on, sleep deprivation in itself, putting alarms on him so he couldn't move or sleep, making him puke up food.
And you see his head is getting lower and lower the more they talk about. So now it's being framed, and they've been very clear that he doesn't have any intellectual disability, so he does understand what's going on. It's now being framed that he's a danger to the public. He's not going to get the help that he needs. And as they're describing all of the things that he was a part of, I think that he's really, truly realizing that he is not going to get a light sentence, that he's not going to get out of this easily. So he continues to get deeper and deeper.
There's bathroom timers, sleeping in the closet with a tarp down, which quite frankly might be considered animal abuse. But we have a human being here, making his hands over his head. And then at the end of his life, an 8-hour practically ice bath that killed him.
And as you can see, he's wincing right now. And it's hard not to imagine that it's possible that this is performative in some sense, because he had a similar reaction during testimony, and it seemed dramatic. It was extreme. And it was basically the only expression of emotion that you were seeing. So seeing this tense sort of clenching of his face does not seem consistent with somebody who is feeling a lot of sadness about this event, because he's not showing it at any other point when they're talking about Timothy. Watch this again right here, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Hour practically ice bath that killed him. So no, I don't think any of those things are adequately taken into consideration by the guidelines. And I don't.
So at this point, you're seeing disappointment. You're seeing him being upset. Maybe he's angry. Maybe that's what that face was about. But he's getting lower and lower, because at this point, he realizes the sentencing is not going to go well.
I think the guidelines, quite frankly, these guidelines don't justify Mr. Ferguson's actions. Mr. Ferguson, I think you are.
If you're somebody who's manipulative and you're used to being able to manipulate others, then the belief that you're going to be able to manipulate your way out of this situation is probably pretty high. So before all of this, he may have believed that he was going to get what he wants, that he was going to get a light sentence, that he was going to be able to maybe somehow get out of this without being punished to the fullest extent of the law. And so we're seeing in a very real time the result of somebody realizing that that's not going to be the way it goes and that their manipulations didn't work.
Based on all that, it's a sentence of the court. You serve 30 years to 100 years, Michigan Department of Corrections.
Now, you saw very quickly the surge of adrenaline that came through when he said 30 to 100 years. I think that even shocked him. Maybe he wasn't expecting it to be that bad. Watch how strongly he reacts right here.
Court, you serve 30 years to 100 years, Michigan Department of Corrections. Credit for 592 days you've already served.
And you can see how hard he's breathing. That got his heart pumping really, really fast.
Court's going to assess a $68 state cost, $130 crime assessment.
So now the sentencing is done. We'll go ahead and stop here. Hopefully this has helped you better understand some of what we observed from Paul Ferguson. Very similar to his mother, he has very shallow emotions. It seems that he has the ability to be quite manipulative, and from what's described in the reports and based on what they said in court today and what's described by the judge, he has very low empathy. And what we saw in the body language today is someone who has what appears to be pretty shallow emotions. The way he described him having low empathy did seem to be reflected as they talked about what happened to Timothy, as we saw very little reaction other than him realizing that he was going to be in some deep trouble. So sad and so awful and so brutal what Timothy went through when he was still here. The torture is almost hard to comprehend. It really is, because it's about as bad as anything I've ever heard. Fortunately, the judge was not one to be manipulated. He used reports that he had as well as his own judgment to see through any attempts at manipulation or deflecting responsibility, and now it seems that Paul Ferguson will likely be spending the rest of his life in prison. Hopefully this has helped you better understand some of the behavior and body language that we observed today, and if you have any other thoughts or anything else you want me to analyze, as always, please let me know in the comments below. Last thing before we get finished up is I do want to remind you to like and subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. All right, thanks for watching.